Most daily actions are accompanied by a quiet sense of certainty. Decisions feel intentional. Outcomes appear connected to effort. Events seem to follow from choice. This sense of control rarely draws attention to itself. It is not asserted, it is assumed. Embedded in routine, it operates without being questioned. People plan, adjust, and respond with the expectation that their actions meaningfully shape what follows. This expectation does not require proof. It is supported by familiarity, by repetition, by the appearance of order. In many situations, this feeling is functional. It allows decisions to be made without hesitation. It reduces uncertainty. It provides a stable frame through which experience can be organized. Yet beneath this stability lies an assumption that is rarely examined, that influence is proportional to intention, that involvement implies control, that choice reliably translates into outcome. This assumption persists even when outcomes remain unpredictable, even when events unfold independently of effort, even when results contradict expectation. Rather than diminishing, the sense of control often remains intact. It adapts. It shifts focus. It attributes variation to temporary factors rather than to structural limits. In uncertain conditions, this tendency becomes more pronounced. The less predictable a situation appears, the more strongly control is felt internally. Small actions take on increased significance. Minor choices feel consequential. This response is not irrational. It reflects how the mind manages unpredictability. When external structure weakens, internal structure compensates. As a result, control is experienced not as a measure of actual influence, but as a psychological orientation, a way of relating to events rather than directing them. This orientation does not require success to persist. It does not depend on outcomes aligning with expectation. Its strength lies in perception, not in evidence. Over time, the boundary between influence and involvement becomes less distinct. Participation is mistaken for causation. Presence is taken as agency. What emerges is a quiet confidence in one's position within unfolding events, a confidence that feels justified because it is familiar, because it has always been there. Only when this confidence is examined closely does its structure become visible. Only then does it reveal itself as something other than what it appears to be. This is not a sudden realization. It does not arrive as contradiction. It unfolds gradually, as attention shifts from outcome to process. What follows is not the absence of control, but a clearer understanding of how the feeling of control is formed, and why it remains so compelling, even when its limits are apparent. Meta. Sex 1.0. As attention turns toward the structure of this experience, its foundations begin to appear. The sense of control does not arise from a single source. It is assembled from several cognitive processes working together. One of these processes is prediction. The mind constantly anticipates what is likely to happen next. When events align with these expectations, the experience is registered as confirmation. Prediction feels like influence. Over time, repeated alignment between expectation and outcome strengthens this impression. Even when the alignment is coincidental, it is interpreted as meaningful. The mind favors continuity over randomness. Habit plays a similar role. Repeated actions create familiarity. Familiarity reduces perceived uncertainty. When outcomes follow familiar patterns, they appear manageable, even if they are not actively shaped by the individual. This creates an important shift. What is predictable begins to feel controllable. Regularity is mistaken for agency. The absence of surprise is interpreted as the presence of influence. Another contributing factor is the assumption of causality. The mind seeks connections between actions and outcomes. When an action precedes an event, the sequence itself suggests a relationship. Temporal order is treated as evidence. This tendency is efficient. It allows the mind to build coherent narratives about how the world operates. However, it does not discriminate carefully between actual causation and perceived association. As a result, involvement becomes closely linked to outcome in perception. When individuals participate in a process, they feel more responsible for its result. This responsibility is experienced as control, regardless of the true level of influence involved. Choice further reinforces this effect. Being given options increases the sense of agency. Selecting among alternatives creates the impression that the selected path is shaped by intention. Even when the options themselves are limited, or the outcome is largely determined by external factors, the act of choosing amplifies the feeling of control. Decision-making becomes symbolic of influence. Importantly, none of these processes operate in isolation. Prediction, habit, causality, and choice interact continuously. Together they create a stable internal experience of control that feels justified by structure rather than by result. This experience remains largely implicit. It is not evaluated moment by moment. It is assumed as part of how situations unfold. Because of this, the sense of control is rarely tested directly against reality. When outcomes align with expectation, the feeling is reinforced. When they do not, alternative explanations are readily available. External factors are blamed. Timing is questioned. Circumstances are adjusted in interpretation. The core assumption remains intact. Over time, this creates a resilient internal model. The mind maintains a sense of agency even in environments where influence is limited or indirect. Control becomes a lens rather than a measurement. At this stage, the experience still feels intuitive. It has not yet been separated into concept or category. It functions as a background orientation toward events. Only when unpredictability increases does the structure become more visible. Only then does the contrast between felt control and actual influence begin to stand out. This contrast marks the point where the experience invites closer examination. As uncertainty enters a situation, the experience of control begins to change. Predictable patterns weaken. Outcomes become less clearly linked to effort. The structure that usually supports confidence becomes less stable. Rather than reducing the sense of control, uncertainty often intensifies it. When external conditions are difficult to anticipate, internal regulation increases. The mind compensates for unpredictability by strengthening its orientation toward agency. In uncertain environments, small actions gain symbolic importance. Minor adjustments feel necessary. Routine behaviors are repeated with greater attention. These actions do not alter the structure of the situation, but they restore a sense of involvement. This response serves a psychological function. It limits the discomfort associated with randomness. It allows experience to remain organized, even when outcomes cannot be reliably predicted. Time equals 1.0 seconds uncertainty challenges the assumption that events follow intention. In response, the mind seeks alternative signals of influence. Any action that can be interpreted as purposeful becomes a source of reassurance. Ritualized behavior often emerges in these conditions. Actions are repeated not because they are effective, but because they feel stabilizing. The repetition itself becomes evidence of agency. This pattern has been observed across many contexts: in games of chance, in high-stakes decision-making, in environments where outcomes depend on variables beyond individual control. The less direct influence individuals possess, the more value is placed on perceived involvement. Choice, timing, and personal input are emphasized, even when their impact is limited. The experience of control shifts from outcome-based to process-based. Importantly, this shift is not deceptive by intention. It is not an attempt to deny uncertainty. It is a way of maintaining coherence in the face of incomplete information. From a cognitive standpoint, this behavior reflects an adaptive response. The mind prioritizes stability over accuracy when predictability declines. Maintaining a sense of control becomes more important than assessing its objective validity. As a result, perceived control may increase precisely when actual influence decreases. This inversion does not feel contradictory, it feels necessary. The experience remains compelling because it aligns with the mind's need for structure. Without some sense of agency, events would appear fragmented and unmanageable. Control, even when illusory, provides continuity. At this stage, the distinction between genuine influence and psychological orientation becomes blurred. The feeling of control is sustained not by effectiveness, but by familiarity. It continues to operate as a background condition. Only when this pattern is isolated and examined does its nature become clear. Only then does it shift from a felt necessity to an object of study. This shift marks the point where the experience receives a formal name. As researchers began to isolate this pattern, it became clear that the experience was not incidental. It appeared reliably across different individuals and contexts. What felt personal was, in fact, systematic. In the mid-1970s, psychologist Ellen Langer examined this tendency within situations involving chance and uncertainty. Her work focused on how people interpret their role in events that are largely uncontrollable. Across a series of studies, participants were placed in scenarios where outcomes were determined by random processes. Despite this, many reported a strong sense of influence over the results. Their confidence did not reflect actual control but perceived involvement. Langer observed that the mere presence of choice was enough to increase this feeling. When individuals were allowed to select an option, even among random alternatives, their sense of agency intensified. The outcome itself remained unchanged, but the experience of control grew stronger. Similarly, familiarity played a role. When participants interacted with elements that felt known or repeatable, they reported greater confidence in their influence. Regularity was interpreted as leverage. From these observations, a specific concept emerged. Langer described this tendency as the illusion of control. The term captured a central distinction between actual influence over outcomes and the subjective experience of having such influence. Importantly, the illusion was not framed as a mistake to be corrected. It was understood as a natural extension of cognitive processes that usually serve adaptive functions. Prediction, choice, and involvement typically help individuals navigate complex environments. Under conditions of randomness, however, these same processes extend beyond their effective range. They continue to generate a sense of agency, even when influence is minimal or absent. The illusion of control, therefore, does not imply that individuals believe they can dominate chance. Rather, it reflects how deeply agency is embedded in perception. When the mind encounters uncertainty, it defaults to interpreting action as impact. This interpretation operates quietly. It does not require explicit belief. Participants did not claim certainty, they simply felt more involved. The strength of the illusion lies in this subtlety. Because it feels like engagement rather than error, It rarely invites correction. It aligns with how attention and responsibility are normally distributed. Over time, the concept provided a framework for understanding a wide range of behaviors, from risk-taking to decision-making, from planning to expectation. What had once appeared as confidence or intuition could now be examined as a structured perceptual bias, one that emerges not from overconfidence, but from the mind's effort to maintain coherence. At this point, the phenomenon had moved beyond individual experience. It had become a defined feature of cognitive psychology, a pattern that could be observed, measured, and discussed across contexts. From here, attention turns naturally toward how this illusion behaves under experimental conditions, how it can be strengthened, and how it reveals itself through behavior. Sex. To explore how the illusion of control operates, researchers turn to carefully designed experimental settings. These environments allowed influence to be measured independently from perception. What participants felt could be compared directly with what they could actually affect. Many of these studies focused on situations governed by chance. Games involving dice, cards, or lotteries provided a controlled framework. Outcomes were random, yet the experience of agency varied significantly. One consistent finding was the effect of choice. When participants were allowed to choose a lottery ticket rather than being assigned one, their confidence increased. They valued the selected ticket more highly. They were less willing to exchange it, despite identical odds. The act of choosing created a sense of ownership. Ownership was interpreted as influence. Even though the outcome remained unaffected, involvement altered perception. There they met similar patterns appeared in dice rolling tasks. Participants who were allowed to throw the dice themselves reported greater confidence than those who observed a roll. The physical act of participation strengthened the feeling of control. The probabilities did not change. In other designs, familiarity played a role. When elements of the task felt known or repeatable, perceived influence increased. Regularity suggested predictability. Predictability was taken as evidence of agency. No importantly, these effects did not depend on belief in skill. Participants did not claim expertise. They did not assert mastery over chance. The illusion operated beneath explicit judgment. Across experiments, a clear pattern emerged. Perceived control was shaped more by structure than by outcome. Choice, involvement, and familiarity consistently elevated confidence, regardless of actual influence. Time equals 1.0 seconds. When these factors were removed, the experience changed. Assigned choices reduced confidence. Observation without participation weakened the sense of agency. The illusion diminished, even though the objective situation remained the same. This contrast highlighted the core mechanism at work. The mind does not evaluate control by measuring impact. It infers control from engagement. Meta, sex. As long as the individual is involved in the process, the experience of agency is maintained. When involvement is reduced, the feeling fades. Outcome remains secondary. These findings extended beyond games of chance. Similar patterns were observed in decision-making tasks, forecasting exercises, and risk assessment scenarios. Whenever individuals participated in shaping a process, perceived control increased. The experiments therefore reinforced a broader interpretation. The illusion of control is not limited to randomness. It reflects a general tendency to equate participation with influence. This tendency operates quietly. It does not require reinforcement. It persists as long as the structure of engagement remains intact. At this stage, the illusion reveals itself not as a flaw, but as a pattern that shapes confidence, expectation, and behavior across contexts. From here, its influence becomes visible in everyday life, beyond the laboratory. beyond controlled settings. 1.0. Outside experimental settings, the illusion of control blends seamlessly into everyday experience. It does not announce itself as a distinct belief. It is embedded in routine decisions, expectations, and interpretations. In professional environments, this tendency often appears in planning and evaluation. Individuals may attribute success to personal strategy and effort, while viewing failure as the result of external disruption. Both interpretations preserve a sense of agency, even when outcomes are shaped by factors beyond individual influence. Long-term plans provide a similar function. Setting goals, creating schedules, and defining milestones establish a framework of involvement. The act of organizing the future strengthens the feeling of control, regardless of how much the plan can actually determine events. In interpersonal relationships, the effect can shape expectations subtly. People may feel responsible for the emotional responses of others. They may assume that intention and effort directly regulate outcomes that are, in reality, shared or unpredictable. This sense of responsibility often feels constructive. It encourages attentiveness and engagement. Yet, it can also lead to overestimation of influence, particularly in complex social dynamics, where outcomes depend on multiple independent agents. Decision-making provides another common context. When individuals actively choose between options, confidence in the chosen outcome increases. Even when alternatives are equally uncertain, the selected path feels more justified. Choice itself becomes evidence of control. In situations involving risk, this confidence can shape behavior. People may underestimate uncertainty when they feel personally involved in the decision process. Participation creates the impression that variability has been reduced. Importantly, these patterns are not inherently maladaptive. They often support persistence, motivation, and engagement. The illusion of control can sustain effort in the face of uncertainty. However, the same mechanism can obscure the role of chance. When outcomes are interpreted primarily through agency, randomness is minimized in perception. Events are seen as more predictable than they truly are. Over time, this interpretation shapes how individuals evaluate their own performance. Success reinforces the sense of influence. Failure is often reframed to preserve it. The internal model remains stable. In everyday life, this stability rarely draws attention. The illusion operates quietly, supporting coherence rather than accuracy. It allows experience to feel structured, even when reality remains complex. The effect is most visible not in dramatic errors, but in subtle adjustments. In how confidence is maintained. In how expectations are managed. In how uncertainty is tolerated. Understanding this influence does not require rejecting agency. It invites a more precise distinction between involvement and control, between effort and outcome. From here, the focus shifts again, not toward eliminating the illusion, but toward recognizing why it persists in modern contexts, and how contemporary environments continue to sustain it. In contemporary environments, the conditions that support this tendency have expanded rather than diminished. Modern systems emphasize planning, optimization, and measurement. These structures encourage the experience of agency, even when influence remains limited. Technology plays a central role in this shift. Digital tools allow individuals to track, adjust, and respond in real time. Dashboards, metrics, and notifications create the impression that outcomes are continuously manageable. This constant availability of information alters perception. When data is accessible, uncertainty feels reduced. The presence of feedback is interpreted as evidence of control, even when it does not alter underlying dynamics. Planning systems reinforce this effect. Calendars, forecasts, and projections structure the future into discrete units. By organizing time and expectation, they create a sense of alignment between intention and outcome. Yet, many of the variables shaping events remain outside individual influence. External conditions, collective behavior, and random fluctuations continue to operate independently. The structure of control remains perceptual rather than causal. In complex systems, this gap becomes more pronounced. As environments grow more interconnected, outcomes depend on interactions beyond any single perspective. Despite this, personal involvement is often experienced as decisive. Sex. Data-driven environments further complicate this relationship. Quantification creates clarity, but not necessarily influence. Numbers describe patterns. They do not guarantee agency. However, the act of measurement itself strengthens the sense of control. When variables are named and tracked, they feel governable. The distinction between observation and influence becomes less clear. This dynamic is particularly evident in decision support systems. Recommendations, probabilities, and projections guide choice. Selecting among them reinforces the experience of agency, even when outcomes remain uncertain. #Meta pause. Sex 1.0. Importantly, modern contexts do not create the illusion of control. They amplify existing cognitive tendencies. The same mechanisms identified in earlier research continue to operate within new structures. The result is a sustained sense of manageability. Events feel navigable. Uncertainty feels bounded. The experience of control is maintained through interaction rather than outcome. This does not imply that modern individuals are less aware of complexity. It suggests that awareness and agency are experienced independently. Understanding limits does not eliminate the orientation toward control. #Meta pause. Sex 1.0. As environments become more mediated, the illusion adapts rather than weakens. It aligns itself with interfaces, metrics, and procedural choice. The structure changes. The experience remains. At this point, the illusion functions as a background condition of modern life. It supports engagement. It sustains participation. It provides continuity in systems too complex to grasp fully. From here, the narrative begins to slow, not toward resolution, but toward perspective, toward understanding how this experience can loosen without needing to disappear. Sex 1.0. As the pace of interpretation slows, the experience of control begins to soften. The need to anticipate every outcome eases. Attention loosens its grip on prediction. Actions continue, but they feel less burdened by expectation. Decisions are made without immediately being evaluated. The mind allows events to unfold without constant adjustment. This shift does not involve surrender. It is not the abandonment of agency. It is a recalibration of attention. Control remains present, but it no longer defines the entire field of experience. It becomes one element among others, rather than the organizing principle. In this quieter state, uncertainty feels less intrusive. It is acknowledged rather than resisted. The mind no longer needs to compensate for what it cannot determine. The distinction between influence and involvement becomes clearer. Effort is recognized as participation, not guarantee. Outcomes are allowed their independence. Meta, sex, 1.0. As this distinction settles, internal pressure diminishes. The urge to manage every variable recedes. Experience regains its ordinary scale. This easing is subtle. There is no clear moment of transition. It is registered indirectly, through a sense of spaciousness rather than conclusion. The mind continues to plan, adjust, and respond, but it does so with less insistence. Control is no longer something that must be maintained at all times. In this state, understanding does not function as instruction. It does not demand application. It simply alters the tone of perception. The illusion does not disappear. It integrates. It loses urgency without losing presence. What remains is a steadier relationship with uncertainty, a recognition of structure without dependence on it. Time equals 1.0 seconds. From here, the narrative can settle without resolution. It does not need to close a loop. It can remain open, attentive, and quiet. Meta, pause. Sex, 1.0. As the night moves forward, the sense of control no longer demands attention. It remains present, but it no longer defines the moment. Experience unfolds without needing to be directed. Plans exist, intentions remain, but they rest more lightly within awareness. Events continue to emerge from a mixture of structure and chance. Some align with expectation, others do not. Neither requires immediate interpretation. The mind does not abandon its tendency to organize. It simply relaxes its insistence on influence. What cannot be shaped is allowed to remain unresolved. In this quieter orientation, participation is no longer confused with outcome. Effort is recognized as engagement rather than command. Control becomes contextual rather than absolute. Nothing needs to be corrected. Nothing needs to be resolved. The experience stands on its own. The illusion, once recognized, loses its urgency. It remains a feature of perception, not a demand to be managed. Sex, 1.0. As attention settles, the background becomes more present. Time slows. Interpretation recedes. The world continues, partially ordered, partially uncertain, and the mind follows, without resistance. Nothing concludes. Nothing needs to. The process remains ongoing, as perception always is. What remains is a quieter awareness of proportion, of what can be influenced, and what simply unfolds. The night holds both, without distinction. And for a while, that is enough. 1.0